My name is Lauren. 13 years ago, I met Scott at a business networking event. He was a senior manager at a trading company, charming, smart, and with kind eyes that made me feel comfortable. What truly touched my heart, though, was how he talked about his 14-year-old daughter, Julie. The love in his voice when he mentioned her name was undeniable. I had built my chain of beauty salons from scratch. Success had given me everything, except the one thing I wanted most: a family. I couldn't have children, a truth I had come to accept. But meeting Scott and Julie felt like a second chance. 7 months later, we got married and they moved into my house. The difference in our incomes was significant. I earned several times more than Scott. But that never bothered me. Love isn't about money. I was just happy to finally have the family I had always dreamed of. When Julie turned 17, I bought her first car, a safe, reliable one. Her excitement was priceless. "This is really mine?" she asked, tears in her eyes as she hugged me tightly. "Thank you, Lauren. You're the best." 3 years later, when college acceptance letters arrived, I didn't think twice about offering to pay for her education. It wasn't Princeton, but it was a good school, and Julie was overjoyed. Those early years were wonderful. I finally had what I always wanted: a loving husband, a stepdaughter who seemed to appreciate me, and a home filled with laughter. After graduating, Julie decided to stay with us to save money as she started her career. I'll never forget one spring evening when she came home beaming with excitement. She had been dating Eric for 3 years. I knew him well. He was a kind young man, a software engineer who treated Julie with respect and care. When Julie burst through the door, waving her left hand with a sparkling diamond ring on it, I was caught off guard.
"Dad. Lauren."
He proposed, she squealed, bouncing on her toes like a teenager instead of the 26-year-old woman she was. "We're getting married." Scott jumped up to hug her, his face glowing with happiness. As I stood there grinning like a fool, I realized this was the kind of family moment I had always dreamed of. Later that evening, Eric came over, and we opened a bottle of champagne I'd been saving for a special occasion. "I know this is a big ask," Julie said nervously, twisting her engagement ring as she spoke. "But we've been looking at venues and everything, and—" "How much?" I asked, already reaching for my phone to check my bank account. "Well, with everything included, around $230,000, she said quietly, then quickly added, "But of course, we don't expect." "Done," I interrupted with a smile. "I'll set up an account tomorrow for all the wedding expenses." The look of relief and happiness on her face made every penny worth it. "Really? Oh my gosh, Lauren, thank you so much," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around me. I hugged her back tightly, remembering the teenage girl who had welcomed me into her life all those years ago. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of excitement. Julie included me in everything at first. We'd sit at the kitchen table late into the night, flipping through wedding magazines and scrolling through Pinterest boards. She'd text me pictures of dresses she was considering and ask my thoughts on color schemes. "What do you think about these flowers?" she asked one evening, showing me pictures of elaborate bouquets. "Too much? Not enough." "I love the pink peonies," I replied, and she jotted it down in her wedding planner. She found her dream dress, a stunning designer gown that cost more than my first car. But I didn't even flinch at the price. Seeing her eyes light up when she tried it on was worth every dollar. The venue she picked was breathtaking, an elegant historic hotel downtown, complete with crystal chandeliers and marble floors. The menu was full of premium dishes that could impress any food critic. I transferred the money as promised, and Julie dove into the planning with enthusiasm. But about 3 months in, something changed. The detailed updates became brief and vague. Instead of spending evenings planning together, she started rushing through dinner and disappearing into her room or heading to Eric's place. "How's the planning going?" I asked one evening, hoping to reconnect. I'd ask, "How's everything going?" "Fine," she'd reply, barely looking up from her phone. "Everything's on track." When I tried to ask for more details, her answers were vague. "Oh, just finalizing some things." "Don't worry, it's all under control." I told myself not to feel hurt by being left out. Planning a wedding is stressful, and maybe she just needed space to make her own decisions. I remembered being young and wanting to prove I could handle things on my own. Scott noticed my worry one night as we got ready for bed. "Everything okay?" he asked. "You seem a little off." "I'm probably just overthinking," I said, forcing a smile. "It's just that Julie seems different lately, distant." "She's probably just busy with the wedding," he said, kissing my forehead. "You know how it is, so many details to handle. Don't worry too much." I nodded, trying to brush off my concerns, but there was a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. Something felt off. The happy little bubble we had been living in seemed to be developing cracks, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. As the weeks went by, I decided to get more involved in the wedding planning. One morning, while we were having coffee, I brought up something that had been bothering me. "Julie, honey, I was wondering about the guest list," I said casually, watching her scroll through her phone. "Have you figured out how many people you're inviting?" She looked up briefly. "Oh, yeah. We're keeping it small, about 80 people." "That sounds nice. Intimate," I said, nodding. Then I added, "I'd love to include my parents and my sister. They've always adored you, and they'd be thrilled to be there." The change in Julie's expression was immediate and unsettling. Her face turned cold, and she slowly put down her phone. "Actually, we're only inviting close relatives and friends," she said, her tone firm. "This is supposed to be a really personal celebration. I don't want to include people who aren't, actually family." Her words felt like a slap. After 14 years, after everything we'd shared, she didn't see my family as real family. It hit me like a bucket of cold water, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my tone calm. "Julie, I get that you want to keep things small and personal, but my parents have known you since you were 14. They've been there for all your birthdays and even your graduation." I paused and added softly, "And I am paying for the entire wedding. Surely we can make an exception for 4 people who genuinely care about you." Her face immediately twisted into a pout, and I saw anger flash in her eyes when I mentioned money. She pushed her chair back from the table with more force than necessary.
"Fine," she snapped.
"I'll send invitations to your mom and sister. Happy now?" Before I could say anything, she grabbed her phone and stormed out of the kitchen. A few moments later, I heard the front door slam. That evening, Scott walked into our bedroom with a familiar look on his face, the one that warned me I wouldn't like what he was about to say. "We need to talk about what happened with Julie today," he started, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Okay," I said, putting my book down. "What about it?" "She called me earlier, crying. She said you were really rude to her about the guest list. She's staying at Eric's tonight because she's so upset." I stared at him in disbelief. "Rude?" "Scott, she told me my family isn't welcome at her wedding. A wedding that I'm paying for." And I stayed calm the entire time when I talked to her about it. "I know," he said gently, "but maybe you could have been a little more careful with how you said it. She's under a lot of stress with all the wedding planning." I explained exactly what had happened, word for word, and I could see him processing it. He ran a hand through his hair, something he always did when he was troubled. "Okay," he finally said. "I get it now. I'll talk to her about it tomorrow." The next 3 weeks passed uneasily. Julie came back home and acted like nothing had happened. She chatted about wedding details during breakfast and even asked my opinion on centerpieces again. But something didn't feel right, like the quiet before a storm. And then the bombshell dropped at dinner. "So," Julie said, pushing her pasta around her plate, "Mom found out about the wedding. She's back in town." I nearly choked on my wine, and Scott's fork clattered against his plate. In 14 years, Julie's mother, Kelly, had barely been a topic in our home. All I knew was the basics. Kelly had struggled with drinking, which led to her divorce from Scott. After that, she moved to California and essentially abandoned Julie. No birthday cards, no Christmas calls, nothing. "She really wants to be involved in the wedding planning," Julie said, her voice full of excitement I couldn't understand. "Actually, I invited her over for dinner this weekend." I gripped my wine glass tightly. This was my house, the house I'd bought with my own money, the house where I had worked hard to build a home for all of us. The right thing would have been for Julie to ask me first before inviting someone over, especially someone with Kelly's past. But after the guest list argument, I decided to hold my tongue. One more confrontation wasn't worth it. Scott didn't say a word. He suddenly looked very interested in his pasta. That weekend, I spent hours preparing dinner, a perfectly roasted rack of lamb, vegetables, and homemade bread. I wanted everything to be flawless, though I couldn't explain why I felt the need to impress a woman who had abandoned her own child. Kelly showed up exactly 50 minutes late. She was tall and blonde like Julie, but where Julie was soft and warm, Kelly seemed sharp and cold. Her eyes scanned every corner of my home as she walked in, lingering on the artwork, the furniture, and the view from the windows. Her gaze wasn't subtle, it was the kind of look meant to measure and judge. "What a large house," she said, dragging out the word large as if it were something to be ashamed of. Dinner started politely enough, but that didn't last long. Kelly took a bite of the lamb and pursed her lips. She said, cutting another piece with slow, deliberate movements. "You know, I always made this with rosemary and garlic. It really brings out the flavor better. Julie used to love it when I made it." Her tone was light, but the words felt like a jab, as if she was reminding me that no matter what, she would always be Julie's mother. I took a sip of wine and stayed quiet. Kelly wasn't done. "And these vegetables," she went on, pushing them around her plate. "They're a bit overdone, don't you think? I always found keeping them crispy makes them so much better." With every comment, I waited for Scott to speak up, anything to defend me. He had been married to this woman before. He knew exactly what she was doing. But he stayed silent, his eyes fixed on his plate, cutting his food into smaller and smaller pieces. I sat there, feeling the weight of her words as she criticized my cooking in my own home. Meanwhile, my husband said nothing, and my stepdaughter looked at Kelly like she was a queen returned to her throne. Something inside me shifted, hardened, as I watched the scene unfold. As dinner wound down, Kelly dabbed her lips with her napkin and turned to Julie. "So, honey, tell me about the venue. Which hotel did you pick?" "The Grand Morrison downtown," Julie replied, her face lighting up at the change in topic. "It's beautiful, Mom. They have these amazing crystal chandeliers." Kelly's expression soured. "Oh, sweetie, you can't have your wedding there. That place is so basic. Now, the Belmont Plaza. That's where you should be having it. It's much more prestigious." I gripped my fork tighter, knowing the Belmont Plaza cost almost double what we were already spending. "The wedding we're planning isn't exactly cheap," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "And the Grand Morrison is a beautiful venue." Kelly's eyes narrowed. "Well, you can't cut corners on your only daughter's wedding. It's the most important day of her life." Something in me snapped. 13 years of love, support, and financial sacrifice dismissed as cutting corners by a woman who hadn't even sent her daughter a birthday card. "If you're so worried about the venue," I said, meeting her gaze directly, "feel free to pay for the Belmont Plaza yourself. Since I'm covering the entire $230,000 for this wedding, I think the Grand Morrison will do just fine." The silence that followed was deafening. Kelly's face turned red, and she stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "I can see I'm not welcome here," Kelly announced, grabbing her purse. "Julie, call me tomorrow, honey." She stormed out, slamming the front door behind her. Julie spun around to face me, her face red with anger. "How dare you?" she screamed. "How dare you throw money in my mom's face like that? You're cruel and selfish, and you've ruined everything." Then she ran upstairs, slamming her door shut. I sat there, stunned, as Scott poured himself another glass of wine. Later that night, he came into our bedroom, looking serious. "You need to apologize to Julie," he said firmly. "What you said to Kelly was completely out of line." I stared at him, shocked. "Apologize? For what? Telling the truth? Your ex-wife came into my house, insulted everything I did, and called me cheap for paying for this entire wedding. You didn't have to embarrass her like that," he shot back. "Now Julie's upset, too." "I'm not apologizing," I said firmly. "Not this time." He grabbed his pillow.
"Fine.
"I'll sleep in the living room until you come to your senses." The next morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone rang. It was my mom. "Laura, honey," she said, her voice full of concern. "I wanted to ask you about Julie's wedding. What's the date and the venue? Your dad and I haven't received an invitation yet, and neither has Olivia. I thought maybe they got lost in the mail." I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen counter, staring into space. My coffee grew cold beside me as the morning sun moved across the floor. With each passing minute, my anger grew stronger. Around 12, I heard Julie's key in the lock. She had been out since breakfast, probably with Kelly. "Julie," I called out, keeping my voice steady even though I was boiling inside. "We need to talk." She walked into the kitchen, still wearing the same clothes from the day before. "What is it?" she asked, not quite looking me in the eye. "I just got a call from my mom," I said, watching Julie's face closely. She was asking about the wedding invitations, the ones that never arrived. Julie's expression hardened, and a look I'd never seen before crossed her face. She lifted her chin defiantly. "I'm not inviting them," she said. "Excuse me? I'm not inviting strangers to my wedding," she replied, her words sharp and cold. The word strangers hit me like a punch. My parents had been at every Christmas, every birthday, every milestone for 14 years. My sister had even helped Julie prepare for her college interviews. "Strangers?" I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "That's wrong, Julie. And it's cruel. These people have loved you and supported you for years." She laughed, but it wasn't a laugh I knew. It was bitter and harsh. "You want to talk about cruel? After the way you treated my mom last night?" Her eyes burned with anger. "Actually, you know what? I don't want you at my wedding either." Time seemed to freeze. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. 13 years of love, support, and sacrifice, all reduced to this moment. "Let me get this straight," I said slowly. "You don't want me, the person paying for your entire wedding, to attend?" "That's right," she said, lifting her chin even higher. An odd sense of calm washed over me. All the hurt and anger of the past few weeks solidified into a kind of clarity. I smiled, and the unexpected reaction seemed to unnerve her slightly. "That's fine," I said lightly. "I won't come to your wedding." Without another word, I walked upstairs to my home office. My hands were steady as I logged into my banking app and removed Julie's access to the wedding account. It took less than a minute, just a few clicks, to undo what had taken 14 years to build. Then I picked up the phone and called Brian, the wedding planner. He answered on the second ring. "Brian, this is Lauren Harrison. I need you to cancel all the wedding arrangements." "Excuse me?" Brian sounded confused. "Is everything okay?" "No, it's not," I said honestly, "but it will be. Please cancel everything and refund the money to my account." My next call was to the Grand Morrison. The events manager was polite but firm. They couldn't refund the deposit for the food and drinks that had already been ordered. A few $1,000s were lost, but at that moment, it felt worth it. That evening, the house was quiet. Scott was still sleeping on the couch in the living room. As I got ready for bed, I could hear him shifting restlessly. Lying alone in the dark, I realized something surprising. I didn't feel sad anymore. I felt free. The next morning, I dressed carefully. I put on my favorite blue silk blouse and pearl earrings, like armor for what I knew was coming. When I finally went downstairs for breakfast, the tension hit me immediately. Julie and Scott were already at the kitchen table, clearly waiting for me. As soon as I walked in, Julie shot to her feet, her face red with fury. "What did you do?" she screamed. "How dare you cancel my wedding? How dare you block my access to the account? That money was for my wedding." I poured myself a cup of coffee, keeping my movements calm and steady. "I'm not going to pay for a wedding I'm not invited to," I said simply, taking a sip. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice rising as tears started to stream down her face. "You've ruined everything. The venue, the flowers, the dress, it's all gone." I set my coffee cup down carefully. "Actually, I can do this." And I did. "Why don't you ask the people you do want at your wedding to pay for it?" Her face crumpled, and she let out a heartbreaking sob before running from the kitchen. Her footsteps pounded up the stairs, followed by the slam of her bedroom door. Scott stood up slowly, his face dark with anger. "Fix this," he growled. "Right now. Call everyone back, reopen the account, and put everything back in place. Or I'll file for divorce." His words hung in the air like a threat, and in that moment, 14 years of marriage seemed to shrink into nothing. I looked at the man I once loved, really looked at him, and wondered how I had missed this side of him all these years. "Okay," I said calmly. "File for divorce. I'm not against it." The color drained from his face. He clearly hadn't expected that response. "Lauren, you can't be serious," he said, his voice shaky. "I am," I replied firmly. "And since this is my house, I'd like you and Julie to leave by tomorrow." His anger seemed to deflate like a balloon. "Look," he said, his tone softer now, almost pleading. "I overreacted. We need to talk about this, think it through." "I've already thought it through," I said, cutting him off. "I'm done living with people who don't appreciate or respect me. I'm done trying to buy love." The rest of the day passed in a haze of slammed doors and muffled arguments upstairs. At exactly 8 p.m., Scott and Julie stood in the foyer with their suitcases. Julie's eyes were red and swollen from crying. "I never thought you could be so cruel," she said, her voice trembling with anger. I felt a laugh bubble up inside me, a laugh of pure disbelief. "Cruel?" I asked, shaking my head. "I paid for your clothes, your car, your education. I gave you a home. I loved you like my own daughter and was ready to spend $230,000 on your wedding. And you're calling me cruel because I won't let you treat me like dirt." Neither of them had a response. The door closed behind them with a soft click, so much quieter than the angry slams of the past few days. I stood in my foyer, my house, and listened to the silence. It felt different, lighter, somehow, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. In the days that followed, I busied myself by reorganizing the house, reclaiming rooms that had slowly become filled with Julie's things over the years. It felt healing, like cleaning out an old wound. Then, one evening as I sipped a glass of wine on the patio, a message popped up on my social media. It was from Eric's mother. "I hope you realize what you've done," it read. "This wedding could fail entirely because of your actions. How can you be so heartless?" I took my time responding, carefully choosing my words. "I'm not heartless," I wrote back. "I'm just done being disrespected. I won't pay for a wedding I'm not even invited to. If you're so worried about the wedding, feel free to pay for it yourself." She read the message, but didn't reply. I imagined her sitting there, probably as shocked as Scott had been, unable to believe I wouldn't back down. It's funny how people react when you finally stand up for yourself. They look at you like you've broken some unspoken rule. The next day, I called my lawyer. She had helped draft my prenup 14 years ago, and now she helped me end the marriage it had protected. The divorce papers were ready in a week. When I called Scott to tell him, he tried his usual tactics. "Laura, please," he said, his voice soft and pleading, the voice that used to make my heart melt. "We can start over. We can fix this." I hung up. The next morning, he came to pick up the papers. He looked older somehow, worn out. The confident man who had threatened me with divorce just days before now seemed lost. "Julie's been crying nonstop," he said, standing in my foyer, no longer our foyer. "The wedding's going to be at City Hall now. No reception, no flowers, no fancy dress. Just a simple ceremony." I shrugged, remembering all the tears I had shed over their betrayal. "That's not my problem." "How can you be so cold about this?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. "It's not cold, Scott," I said evenly. "It's just not my responsibility anymore." He took the papers and left. I watched as he walked to his car, the car I had bought him, and drove away. It felt final. Not sad, just finished. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. The prenup made everything straightforward. He couldn't touch my house, my business, or any of my assets. Sometimes I wondered if he had ever truly read that document, if he understood what it meant when he signed it all those years ago. But it didn't matter anymore. People occasionally ask me if I know how Julie's wedding turned out. Did she wear the dress she picked? Was Kelly there? Was it everything she had dreamed of? I don't know. I blocked them all on social media, changed my phone number, and moved on with my life. What I do know is this: you can't buy love, not real love anyway. You can't buy respect, gratitude, or loyalty. And now I don't have to try. I spent 14 years trying to create a family with my money, but in the end, all it got me was a front row seat to see that family choose someone else over me. But the thing about endings is that they're also new beginnings. My house is quiet now, my business is doing better than ever, and when I sit in my garden with my morning coffee, watching the sunrise over the flowers, I don't feel lonely. I feel free.